Good morning, everyone. So welcome to day two, full day yesterday. Really exciting lineup today. Actually, an even longer day. We got such an exceptional number of wonderful papers, but we're going to start with two really super interesting keynotes this morning. And so we start with Irene, and Irene is at EdHec Business School in France. Irene is one of the pioneers in terms of climate stress testing. I won't go into a particularly long introduction because we've got a great deal to do, but yeah, as I said, she's really one of the pioneers in this new field called climate stress testing for financial institutions. She's published some of the seminal papers along with Stefano Battison in stuff like Science and Nature on this subject. So really important topic, important that we the world makes progress on this hugely important issue. So Irene, welcome. And so this is part of actually, a subsection of the conference called Debt, Bonds and Banks. And so, you know, we've got some of our New Zealand's leading banking experts here. So, I'm sure they're really looking forward to this. So Irene, welcome. And we look forward to hearing about the evolution of this really new important topic of climate stress testing. So welcome, kia ora. Are you there, Irene?
Yep, I'm here, and thank you so much for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Very well, loud and clear.
Great. So now we'll try to share my screen, and then I will briefly introduce myself and start. So thank you so much for this for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually with you today and to discuss about what we learned in several years of research on climate stress testing and sketch out some points for research steps ahead that could be of interest both for researchers but also for practitioners and financial supervisors. My name is Irene Monasterolo. I am Professor of Climate Finance at EdHec. And today I'm going to present really some of the insights on about several articles. So first, a bit of background and motivation. So why are we doing this? Why we started to work on climate financial risk assessment already in 2015? Well, because at that time we had a man called Mark Carney, was the former governor of the Bank of England, who talked about, who gave a historical speech at the Lloyd's of London about the tragedy of the horizon. Actually, his talk wanted to create awareness and to create awareness among financial actors, in particular insurance companies, about the impact for the business of climate change and to foster them to take into consideration, in particular, physical risk and transition risk. Through the years, there has been growing concern among central banks, financial regulators, and overall financial supervisors about the impact of climate change on financial stability via either physical risk, but in particular via transition risk, which consists of the way in which we do or not do the transition. And in particular, the over 100 central banks and financial regulators joined the Network for Green the Financial System, which recognized climate change as a new source of risk for financial stability, and as well designed scenarios for supervisors, but also for investors to do climate stress tests. Their scenarios, in particular, are among the scenarios, the disorderly transition scenarios, so those that are characterized by a late and sudden introduction of climate policies, such as a carbon tax, are of interest for price volatility and financial stability, because in that context, financial actors cannot fully anticipate the impact of the policy on asset valuation. In this context, stress test, and in particular balance sheet stress test, is a primary tool for assessing the financial stability implications of climate change, and balance sheet stress tests have been increasingly used by financial supervisors, in particular in the aftermath of the last financial crisis, to ensure an orderly functioning and stability of financial markets. But however, when we want to move from stress test to climate stress test, there are some challenges that we should consider. And the major challenge is the nature of climate risk, which is characterized by nonlinearity, deep uncertainty, and endogeneity. In this regard, in 2017, we published on Nature Climate Change, the climate stress test of the financial system, which introduced for the first time an approach to integrate forward-looking climate mitigation scenarios, such as those that are provided now by the Network for Greening the Financial System, into adjustment in financial valuation and in financial risk metrics, as well as an assessment of the direct and indirect losses, so using financial network models. This approach has been reviewed over time and now has been used and followed also by several central banks of the Network for Greening the Financial System, also in their climate stress test. Importantly, what we found already at that time is that financial institutions are largely exposed to climate transition risk and to what we, through what we called climate policy relevant sectors, so economic activities that are highly relevant for transition risk, but also highly exposed to risk of stranded assets. And in particular, the exposure was over 40% for the equity portfolio of pension funds. Furthermore, the losses could be amplified by the structure of the financial network, and in particular by financial interconnectedness, so what we analyze as second round effects. But however, through the years, we keep on developing climate stress tests through different applications. So the first analysis was focused on equity holdings and interbank interbank market. But more recently, we developed applications for corporate bonds, for sovereign bonds, and for loans. And what we got in this regard are three main messages that I would like to share with you. The first is that climate risk is forward-looking, and this brings us to consider how to use traditional financial tools. So what type of tools do we need to consider this characteristic, this type of risk? Well, when we talk about forward-looking risk, and before we said climate change is characterized by deep uncertainty, nonlinearity, and endogeneity, in this context, past data, for instance, data on stock prices for high carbon, low carbon firms alone don't tell us much about the exposure of the economic activity that issue the contracts, as well as the investors who buy them, to future climate transition risk. An example, we never had a low carbon transition in the past. Thus, we cannot expect that financial markets can fully price it. And this challenges traditional financial risk metrics, which are based on efficient market hypotheses. Second, in this context, we need to work with scenarios. And working with scenarios is not new at all in stress tests. So, and indeed, the scenarios plays a major role in stress testing. But it's absolutely important to get the scenarios right and to use them in the right way. Indeed, it might be tempting to develop scenarios of firms' emissions. Now we are supported by machine learning and so artificial intelligence and so on, but we should pay attention because about what drives the performance of a firm in the low carbon transition and thus its alignment to the climate scenarios. These are not only emissions, but importantly, the energy technology profile of the company, as well as the sensitivity to changing climate policies. And third, scenarios, as we say, that's very important in climate stress tests, but we should consider that so far, climate mitigation scenarios that we use in climate stress tests are not fully consistent for this analysis because they neglect the role of finance and its complexity. And this can lead to underestimate potential risk and opportunities for investors in the transition, and doesn't properly allow us to understand under which conditions finance could be a driver or a barrier to climate mitigation. In this context, and a major characteristic of climate risk is that climate risk is endogenous. What does it mean? It means that our perception, and with our, I mean, not only me, you, but in particular those who are decision makers' perception of risk across climate scenarios, feedbacks on the realization of risk itself, because depending on how investors, for instance, perceive the risk for high and low carbon firms across the NGFS climate scenarios, they can decide to adjust or not their investment strategy. And this, of course, with feedback on, for instance, the cost of capital for firms. Thus, in this context, we could face multiple economic scenarios with unknown probability, thus potentially leading to a situation where we have multiple equilibria. And of course, we have characteristics of tail risk, where historical market information thus is not sufficient to consider them. And in this context, also, investor sentiments come to play a major role. And with investor sentiments, we mean the expectations of investors about future risk and opportunities of climate change and the potential anticipation of the scenarios in their investment decision. So why do we do climate stress tests? We do climate stress tests to analyze to what extent are individual financial institutions or overall the whole financial system exposed to climate risk. So we want to assess the largest direct and indirect losses conditioned to the climate scenarios. We do climate stress tests to assess under which conditions financial institutions would be able to absorb such risk, or in contrast, they could amplify risk. And of course, we do it to inform regulatory policies that are aimed to support investors or foster, help investors to withstand such risk, such as revision of banks' capital requirements in the context of large climate impacts. A key message in this context is that doing climate stress tests is important, and the way we do it is even more. And this is because the underestimation of risk can lead to moral hazard and a socialization of losses. And we saw in the last financial crisis where it could bring, and probably with climate change, we could have even a larger crisis. And we don't have, we will not be able to face it again. As I said before, in the climate stress test of 2017, we showed how to go from climate scenarios. So we proposed a methodology to go from climate mitigation scenarios to climate stress test, considering the nature of climate risk. The approach can be explained into 5 steps. The first step is climate risk disclosure, and to this regard, we developed the climate policy relevant sectors, which are a classification of economic activities into group of assets that allow us to group assets into unique categories of transition risk. The second step is the use of climate mitigation scenarios for climate financial risk assessment. And the climate mitigation scenarios are those produced by the process-based integrated assessment models that are also used now by the Network for Green Financial System. The third step is adjusting financial valuation conditioned to the shock obtained from the climate scenarios. And the fourth step is network-based climate stress test and adjustment in financial risk measures such as value at risk and expected shortfall. And the last step, which is the new research challenge ahead, is the introduction of endogeneity into climate scenarios. So how to represent and embed the role of finance and the complexity of the financial system in the realization of climate mitigation scenarios in order to have more coherent climate scenarios. So here is a visual representation of the step of the climate stress test that we are going to analyze soon. So we go from climate scenarios. Here you have the trajectories, for instance, of CO2 emission concentration that would lead us to different temperature increase. And for the RCP 2.6 is the 2 degrees, stands for the 2 degrees target. Then from here, we calculate, from the integrated assessment model, we obtain change in output of economic activities, depending on their energy technology profile. Here we have, for instance, a decrease in fossil fuels and an increase in renewable energy. From this, and here it's where we start to work with our model, because from these two steps, actually take the scenarios from the IPCC or now the NGFS, we calculate with the integrated assessment model the change in market share of the different economic activities depending on the energy technology. And here we start to work with our model, where we calculate the shock on the market share of each activity from a baseline scenario of current policy, conditioned to scenarios of mild or tight climate policies like 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees targets. Then we adjust the price of the financial asset, considering the shock on the profitability of the company that is included in the sector, where we have the change in output. And then from here, the adjustment in price, we adjust financial risk metrics, such as value at risk. And finally, we run the financial network model to assess the direct and indirect losses. Starting from the climate financial risk disclosure, why we develop the climate policy relevant sector? Well, because traditional metrics that are used as a proxy of transition risks, such as emissions or carbon footprint, despite being necessary, are not sufficient to disclose how well a company is prepared to the transition or how much risk it's exposed to. Let's make an example with the simplest and type of emissions, and for which we have available information, which is scope 1, which are the direct emissions. Well, an electricity company with coal-based power plants could reduce its scope 1 emissions not by decarbonizing its activity, but actually by expanding its business line into electricity trading. And in this regard, only looking at its emission profile will not tell us much about how well this company is aligned to the transition objectives. On the other hand, there has been growing research using ESG, so environmental social governance instruments, but again, there has been growing debate about the lack of correlation of ratings across rating agencies, what Berg et al. Called aggregate confusion. Also, we should consider that the driver for a company of being prepared or not for the transition is actually what type of energy it produces or it uses for its business. Thus, the energy technology profile plays a major role. And finally, were some discussion about why couldn't we use just the traditional classification of economic activities, like in the European Union, we use the NACE codes. In the US, they use NICE codes, so they are equivalent. Well, because these classifications were designed for national accounting, but not to account for climate risk. This is why we needed to reclassify economic activities from NACE codes into unique classes of decreasing climate transition risk. Why? Because if we can do so, such categories can be applied immediately across all financial portfolios and jurisdiction to do climate financial risk assessment. And this is what we do. So what you see here on the left are the 5 main climate policy relevant sectors, which is at the most aggregate level. Now, through the years, we further disaggregate them, and we have now over 1,000 NACE codes. And they are based on, their identification is based on 3 main criteria. The first is still emissions, so the direct or indirect contribution to emissions of the economic activity. But importantly, we consider the energy technology profile of the activity, not only of the parent firm, but also of its business lines. And then we consider the input sustainability, so the business and revenue shares, which is something that it's just a most recent development. And finally, the relevance for climate policy implementation. So if we do this, actually, we can identify within each NACE sector, for instance, NACE sector B is mining and quarrying, C is manufacturing, D is utility, air conditioning and gas, F is transport, and so on. So is housing, and H is transport. So what we see here is that if we only take NACE 2-digit codes, actually we would lose information, because activities, for instance, that are related to fossil fuels, which we would expect to find in section B, actually we find also in other categories, like in manufacturing or in transport, for instance, gas pipelines. Thus, what we did was to reclassify all these NACE codes, so over 1,000 codes, depending on these 3 criteria that we discussed here, into unique categories of transition risk. And then what we did was to associate the ISIN codes, so of the financial contracts, to the company that issued that and that was classified into climate policy relevant sector. So in this way, we could reclassify in terms of climate transition risk exposure, the whole portfolio of investors. This methodology has been applied by all financial regulators in Europe and in the European Union, and also by several central banks, including the European Central Bank and the National Bank of Austria. And here it's the result of an application that we did on US bank loans last year for syndicated loans of the largest 28 US banks. Climate mitigation scenarios. When we talk about scenarios, mostly we talk about NGFS scenarios. These scenarios are not predictions, but are future trajectories that of economic activities that are produced by process-based integrated assessment model, and would allow us to stay within a certain temperature target, for instance, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, conditioned to timing of climate policy introduction, like if in an orderly transition very early, in a disorderly in 2030, the reliance on carbon dioxide removal, and the technology development. These scenarios, and after classifying the activities into climate policy relevant sectors and considering the scenario, we do climate adjusted financial valuation. For each counterparty, we have a technological profile. We analyze the counterparty revenue share by its technologies across climate policy relevant sector, now at a highly granular level. So we can classify, for instance, electricity production out of solar, wind, and so on. We estimate the current market share in each technology. And we also estimate the future production trajectory in a given scenario based on the NGFS sector level trajectories and on the market share of the investor. And finally, we estimate the future cash flow along the time trajectory in each NGFS scenario. So in each scenario included in the orderly or disorderly transition, or even in the hothouse world. But in this analysis today, I'm mostly talking about transition, climate stress test of transition risk. From the technological profile, we move to the counterparty level financial valuation. And we compute financial instruments valuation first under a baseline scenario of current policy. And of course, the way in which you do the financial valuation depends on what type of contract we are talking about. So if you're talking about for equity holdings, is the easiest one. But then it gets a bit more complex when we talk about bonds and loans, when we use compound profits trajectories in a structural model of default, a la Merton. We then calibrate it using counterparties, probability of default, and loss given defaults provided by banks. This is what we did in our recent applications. Then we assume an adjustment in investors' expectations about the realization of the transition scenarios. So moving from a baseline of current policies to either 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, which could be in an orderly or in disorderly way. And then we recompute the financial valuation under the policy scenario to give a valuation adjustment, which show us the adjustment in the value of the financial contract when we move for a specific economic activity, when we move from a current policy to a policy scenario. Yeah, for the sake of time, I will skip this, but I will leave you the...
Irene, it would be nice to have a couple of minutes for questions. So yeah, you've got another...
Yes, just that's why I would like to go here. And finally, the last step after we reevaluate the portfolio is to do run a financial network model to assess the direct exposures and indirect exposures. Well, what did we find in 2017? In 2017, here you can see results for a calculation of the value at risk at 5% on asset losses in US million dollars. And we found that banks that had, in average, a high carbon investment strategy would have had many more problems than banks with a low carbon investment strategy. And in particular, some banks are most exposed to first round losses. So, for instance, which are represented by the darker bars. And here it's the case, for instance, of Deutsche Bank. While other banks, like for instance, Crédit Agricole, are most exposed via second round losses, so via the interbank market. And here we can see, and this is the final slide for today, what happens when we consider only first round losses, so which is the figure on the top with a distribution of, when we see it in this case, we have rather large losses for a bank with a high carbon investment strategy, but these losses could be amplified, which is the bottom figure, when we consider financial interconnectedness. So, and here I conclude, some lessons that we learn is that investors' ability to withstand climate risk depends on the exposure, climate scenarios, and financial risk characteristics. And just briefly on last point for research steps ahead, well, the big challenge here is to try to integrate investors' expectations into climate mitigation scenarios. In our recent model paper published on Science, we plugged the climate financial risk module that I just explained, that was developed within the climate stress test, into the integrated assessment model trajectories in order to embed change in investors' expectations via the change in their interest rate in the output trajectories of the integrated assessment models in order to have climate mitigation scenarios that account for investors' expectations and climate financial risk. But this is just the first framework and the first application. So I hope to see much more research in this direction in the future years. Thank you.
I hope you can hear the applause there, Irene. I'm not sure if that comes through. Real tour de force, really important work you've done. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So thank you very much. I see we've got some people from the External Reporting Board online because they're trying to come to terms with how, well, not just online, actually in person. So we've got good representation from the External Reporting Board online and in person, and because New Zealand is coming to terms with climate related disclosures, and we're a bank-based economy, so the biggest issue is around banks, and the External Reporting Board is talking to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand of how do we understand these risks, right? And of course here at Otago we're doing our own work on this. Are there any questions from the floor? Yeah, I knew David Tripe was going to ask a question. So David Tripe is a professor of banking at Massey University. Yep, over to David.
And this is a comment as much as a question. It's really just one of the issues that's identified in the systemic risk literature as significantly contributing to systemic risk is the correlation of banks' portfolios with each other. And that's in essence because they're all trying to diversify, and they diversify into the same sets of assets. And I think you're seeing exactly the same thing with climate risk, in that they're all diversifying into what end up being relatively equivalent sets of climate exposures. So there will be some, so that will tend to accentuate any systemic risks that may otherwise be observed.
Cool. Do you want to come back on that at all, Irene?
Yeah, so I thank you so much for this comment, and I completely agree. And probably it's not only me to agree, but last week also the European Central Bank published a report about the degree of preparedness in environmental and climate risk disclosure of over 100 banks in the euro area, and it was not very satisfactory. But the point that you make is absolutely important. And in this regard, this is why disclosure of climate-related financial risk is critical. And in this regard, we need both taxonomies of sustainable activities and also taxonomies of unsustainable activities, or what we could consider carbon stranded assets. Because without science-based information on what we can consider univocally sustainable or not sustainable, according to science-based criteria, then we will really risk to have greenwashing, and we risk to have banks to be correlated and on really the same drivers of climate transition risk.
Okay, so we've got a question from someone at the External Reporting Board. Irene, thank you very much. With the new framework to model expectations, do you model investor expectations as having a reflexive relationship with market values, or is the dynamic reflected differently?
So actually what we do is to consider the investors that have expectations about the scenarios, and in this case, these are the NGFS scenarios. And why we do this? Because investors are now, already in the, I just mentioned before the the European Central Bank, but in the euro area, systemic financial institutions already were asked by regulators to use the NGFS scenario. So investors are looking at the scenarios, and what happens if they look at the scenario and adjust their expectations about the performance of high and low carbon firms across scenarios, and for the performance, I mean profitability, return on assets. Well, if they trust the scenarios, then they would include them in the risk adjustment for the same firms, meaning that this will adjust the cost of capital for the firms. And an adjustment in the cost of capital, we expect it to be higher for high carbon firms and lower for low carbon firms, will reflect in different firms' investment strategy, for instance, an investment decision, for instance, via net present value, and thus in a different shape of the NGFS trajectories.
Cool. All right, Irene, I have a question I'd like to ask, but I need to try and keep to time. So, hey, that was really, honestly, really, I mean, I know Quinn is beaming. She's very excited at your presentation. It's been great to have you. I wish we could sit here and ask questions for the next half an hour, but, you know, maybe next time, and next time we'll hopefully have you here in sunny Dunedin. Well, it's raining, but
no, I really look forward. I would really appreciate it. Let's see what will happen in the next year.
In the future, yes. Thank you, Irene, very much, and
thank you.
We will be in touch about the conversations we were having, but we've been busy organizing this event.
Sure. Thank you so much. Bye, and nice conference to everybody.